Hey, well, thanks ever so much for folk joining us today this lunchtime. I'm hoping not to keep you too long, as I say. But today's session, we are going to be covering, as the slide says, an introduction to the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. So essentially how we came to be, and how you can volunteer within the scheme. The main thing really that I wanted to say, first of all, was a very big welcome and thank you for your time. Welcome to anybody that is new to the scheme. Welcome to anybody that is perhaps interested in taking part in the scheme and you're looking to find out a bit more about how to go about it, what's involved, what you sign yourselves up for, so to speak. Bit of a disclaimer, I am currently battling a typical back to school cold, so apologies if I have to go a little bit quiet for a moment to sneeze or whatnot, but we are going to get through. So my name's Rachel Murphy. I am the volunteer manager for the National Plant Monitoring, so I'm based at Plant Life. And today, just to give you a bit of an outline of what we're hoping to cover, I'm planning to give you a bit of a background about the NPMS, why it was started, how to get started as a volunteer, as I say, and then leading on to a more detailed survey methodology. So thinking about plot selection and creation and actually doing the survey on the ground. I plan to also detail the support and the help that you can get with this process. So let's get going. So the National Plant Monitoring Scheme, as the name suggests, is UK-wide. It is a citizen science, habitat-based plant monitoring scheme, and that covers the major freshwater and terrestrial semi-natural habitats. And really the scheme provides an indication of changes in plant diversity and abundance across the UK's habitats through time. And really it helps us to gain a better understanding of overall habitat health. So while we're recording the plant species, we're actually getting a bigger picture of the health of our habitats. And it was really designed to meet a need for a standardised approach to plant monitoring. And that really was identified as a high priority within the terrestrial biodiversity surveillance strategy. And the basis of the NPMS, in short, is that across the UK, monads, or simply put, as I'll be saying throughout this presentation, 1 kilometre squares, they've been randomly designated, and volunteers all across the UK can allocate themselves one or more of these squares to survey twice a year. So the NPMS was designed and developed by a partnership of the BSBI, the UKCEH, the JNCC and Plant Life. So a bit of background on our partners, that the JNCC is the public body that advises the UK government and devolved administrations on UK-wide and actually international nature conservation. The UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology is an independent, not-for-profit research institute, and they carry out environmental science across land, sea and air. The BSBI, the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, is really a society for anyone interested in the flora of Britain and Ireland. In fact, you may well have heard of or seen last year's publication of the BSBI's latest Plant Atlas, Plant Atlas 2020, which is an absolutely amazing, excellent resource for botanists, new to experienced. And then actually in more recent years, we have been supported by DERA, Department for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs in Northern Ireland, with the scheme's expansion to that region. So along with these partners, the scheme was co-developed. As I say, I come from Plant Life, so we're very much involved in the volunteer management, support, training and communications aspect of the scheme. And along with these partners, the scheme was really co-developed with volunteers as well, actually on the ground during a really inclusive trial phase with contributors and volunteers from a variety of backgrounds and experiences, because it was really important, and it still is incredibly important, that the scheme is accessible and inclusive, while also ultimately maintaining robust and standardised methodology and data standards, so we can really make the most of that important data that's being collected. And this is to provide an indication of changes in plant diversity and abundance across the UK's habitats through time. So in the UK, there are long-standing schemes for monitoring populations of bats, birds and butterflies. So for example, thinking about the British Bird Survey and the British Butterfly Monitoring Scheme. But actually, until the NPMS began, there wasn't actually a similar scheme for plants. And of course, with major changes taking place and declines in biodiversity across habitats being reported, for example, through habitat change, nutrient enrichment, climate change, and so on, it really became crucial to have a better understanding of plant populations. So there was, and there still is, a need for a really large scale coverage and a really systematic approach. Otherwise, of course, there's potential to miss any patterns or trends, and actually having a scheme which works with volunteers and citizen scientists up and down the country really facilitates that large scale approach. So as I say, the original 4 partners came together in 2012 to devise the scheme. Quite a thorough pilot was run in 2014. And then in 2015, the NPMS was launched proper, as it were, or as it is today. So that actually makes this field season the 10th year that we've been collecting data using the NPMS survey methodology. And the last couple of years actually have been really pivotal for the scheme, because we now have enough data to start looking at trends and indicators, which of course is always the challenge with a long-term monitoring scheme. You need the first certain number of years worth of data before you can really start reporting on what we're seeing. So we're in the happy position that we are there now. So as I said, they weren't these sort of comparative robust surveys for plants. So there was a need to establish the scheme. And it needed to include semi-natural habitats, so beyond the protected sites. And we wanted to look at what the data could tell us in the future. And the scheme aims to provide habitat inventories and also contribute to remote sensing. And the aims also include investigating drivers of change using NPMS data. So what impact different management types are having on our plant species and our habitats. So considering, for example, habitat management, invasive species, pollution, climate change, and so on. So we just popped this pretty slide in here for a little bit of a reprieve, and just to give a real flavour of the effort, really, of what goes into this national scheme. We record at 3 different recording levels, which I'll go into in a bit more detail as we go through. We ask our volunteers to record twice a year, so to visit their squares and their plots twice a year. Within those squares, we ask our volunteers to survey on 5 small plots within 11 broad habitats that actually can be broken down into 28 fine habitat types, which again, I will cover in a moment. And within the scheme, we are particularly interested in 408 NPMS indicator species. Now, that's not to say everybody will be asked to record 408 species, because of course it completely depends on the habitats that you find within your survey square. But these are indicator species which have been identified as species good at indicating habitat health, whether they're positive indicators of habitat health or negative. And monitoring these NPMS habitat plots twice a year, every year, really does provide an unparalleled opportunity to track and understand the responses of plants to our changing environment. It allows us to investigate growing pressures on our environment. And as I say, it was following our 5th season of surveys that we really started to see stories and patterns and trends emerge from the data. If you've not seen yet our report, Understanding the Health of Our Habitats, you can find that on the research and conservation page of our website and find out a bit more about the partners we are working with, and also the research that the NPMS data are contributing towards. You can also find our annual reports. We launched our 2023 annual report of last year's surveys at the start of this current season, and we'll be producing another one in time for spring in 2025. A real major achievement for the NPMS is its use for the experimental indicator. So towards the end of 2020, DEFRA and the JNCC published their UK biodiversity indicators. And these essentially provide an annual view of how a variety of groups of wildlife and other indicators of action for biodiversity conservation have essentially fared across the UK in recent years. And 2020 was a landmark year for the NPMS because it marked the first ever contribution of NPMS data to a national biodiversity indicator, and specifically NPMS data from 4 of the scheme's best surveyed broad habitats that we can see here. And they've been used to create a new indicator for the category C7, which is plants of the wider countryside. And the indicator is still classed as an experimental indicator, and work on this is ongoing. But just to get to that point in only 5 or 6 years of field surveys really highlights the incredible dedication of NPMS volunteers in getting out into the countryside and establishing and surveying their habitat plots. So this is an absolutely, as I say, landmark moment for the scheme in reaching this so early on. I've just popped another couple of outputs of interest here, including a paper that was published last year by the NPMS partnership investigating how well the NPMS plots and samples that we currently have sampled sample a national gradient of climate change exposure. So essentially using past observed and future modelled climate data to create an index of expected climate change in every 1 kilometre square of the UK. And happily, it did show that NPMS data have very, very good coverage. We also found that warming temperatures have seen some wild plant species such as pyramidal orchid expand their ranges. Some rare Arctic alpine plants, including, you can see here, Norwegian mugwort, are also likely to be at risk of going extinct in Britain as our uplands become more temperate. And the paper actually was very useful in showing that climate change is affecting the UK unevenly. So regionally, it falls more in southern, central and eastern England, and locally, it is greater at higher elevation locations than nearby areas at lower elevations. And it found that climate change is likely to fall hardest on arable and horticultural land, also urban and suburban areas, and particularly calcareous grasslands, so grasslands with a high pH soil. And you can find out more about this and other work ongoing and various applications of NPMS data, as I say, on the research and conservation page of our website. There's oodles there to keep you going. But to just revisit, back to the focus of today's session, the aim of the scheme really is to provide reliable measures of change for individual species and species groups within these semi-natural habitats, and to use both positive and negative indicator species for each habitat. So, as I say, the species included in the scheme were chosen to be both reliable indicators of habitat health, but also species that are widespread and relatively well recognised and easy to identify. The survey design needed to be straightforward, repeatable, and achievable by a wide group of volunteers. So to look more into the basics, once a surveyor is allocated a randomly designated 1 kilometre square, they are asked to establish up to 5 plots, ideally 3 square and 2 linear survey plots. And ideally, these should represent different NPMS habitats if possible. We ask surveyors to record the abundance of these indicator species and other plot characteristics. The survey is carried out twice a year, once in late spring or early summer, and then again in late summer. But that really is a whistle-stop tour of how we go about conducting the NPMS. So we will dive into a bit more detail further along. I thought it was worth just taking a little look at how we're doing so far across the UK. As you can see on the map here, all NPMS squares are either orange, which means they've been allocated to a volunteer, or they are blue, which means they are currently available. You may well have seen a map very similar to this when you were taking a look on the NPMS website, and if you have allocated yourself a square already. We currently have around 1,500 volunteers allocated to a square, and some volunteers actually take on more than 1 square. As you can see, there are still plenty of blue ones on that map there, awaiting a volunteer to take them on. It is worth mentioning at this point that if you have gone to look for a square on this map, only to find those near you are orange, meaning that they're already allocated, please don't discount them at all. Squares are released fairly frequently, either by volunteers leaving the scheme or those moving geographically. And sometimes volunteers are absolutely thrilled with the idea of sharing a square or receiving support from others in the area. So please do get in touch if you are struggling to find a square near you that's available, because there may well be options for those squares that may be released, or somebody may be happy to buddy up, as it were. So do get in touch. You can see here that we have over 1,000 squares for which we currently have data nationwide. And it does say on this slide that we have records from 7,000 surveys to date, but actually that's now out of date because, of course, we've just completed the 2024 survey season. So we need to add 2024 surveys to that number. So I'm quite looking forward to doing that over the winter months. So getting started, I can see I don't have any questions yet within the chat. So hopefully that's all an okay introduction to the scheme, and I'm going to move on to how we actually get started. So once a volunteer has registered with the scheme, then they've requested and they've been allocated a square. They receive or are given access to survey materials. And that includes your survey guidance notes, species and habitat lists, your survey forms, and the map of their 1 kilometre square, and also our lovely species identification guide. Now, the ID guide book is a lovely book, and it was specifically created for the scheme. It's lovely, compact and concise, and it's organised into flower colour, containing just those 408 indicator species that we record within the scheme. But of course, volunteers can and do supplement with their own ID books and keys of choice. So the guidance notes within the pack explains the details of the methodology. The species lists, which you can see there in the picture, show which species are to be recorded for each habitat. And that's dependent on your surveyor level, which we'll cover in a moment. You can also see the recording forms there in the picture tucked behind, which once used in the field are used for uploading the data onto the website when you get back home. And all of these materials are available as a digital survey pack once you sign up as well. So you always have a record of them somewhere, and they are available for download from the NPMS website as well, because I don't know about you, but these things can tend to sprout legs and walk, or if an email gets deleted and whatnot, everything is available to download off the website. When you do receive your survey pack and you are allocated a square, we very much recommend a reconnaissance visit to your square to identify NPMS habitats and potentially establish where the plots should be within your square. Of course, we're not asking our volunteers to survey the entirety of their 1 kilometre square, because I think by the time they'd finished carrying out their surveys, they'd be starting again. So we do just ask our volunteers to survey 5 small plots within that square. We suggest you check within your square details page on our website if there aren't any previously allocated plots on your square. This can be the case if, for example, somebody was previously monitoring that square and then they have moved on to a different square for a change, or perhaps they've moved house, so they've moved elsewhere, perhaps they've simply left the scheme. So the first thing to do is to double check there aren't any previously recorded plots in your square. If there are, we do ask that they are adopted where at all possible, rather than creating new plots, of course, so that we can monitor change, but we completely understand that this isn't always possible. For example, if land use or ownership or habitats have changed. That's what we'd like you to try to do in the first instance. So using initially footpaths or lanes, using an OS map, you can use your various phone apps, Google, you can really start to build a picture of what your square's like, who might own parts of it too, what's access like, where the NPMS habitat is or extends to. And this is also a really good time to consider either the existing plots of your square or the numbered ones on your square map. It can also be really useful to look at satellite maps and even Google Street View actually before heading out, just to give you that really good information before you head out on where to park, even walk, how to get around your square. And it's really worth spending that time to familiarise yourself, getting to know your square. And there is another aspect, of course, that you do need to start considering, and we get a lot of questions about, unsurprisingly, and that's landowner permission. So it is important that for private land that we do have landowner permission to be accessing the land and conducting surveys. Unfortunately, we're not able to obtain that landowner permission for all of our volunteers, purely because we have over 2,000 squares nationwide. And of course, owing to the really dynamic nature of land ownership, where land may be bought, sold, used for different purposes. So it is the volunteers' responsibility, but of course with our support to make sure that you do have land access permission. We found that one really useful way to do this is to use a combination of OS maps online to locate your square by putting in your square ID, and also using Google Maps. You can see if there are any obvious addresses, businesses, farms. Another option is using the land registry website, where you can search on a map for an area and zooming right in. Of course, it won't always give you an address and it won't give you a name, but it's worth checking along. We would never expect you to pay in order to receive information from the land registry. So if you are having any difficulty at all, please do get in touch. We've got oodles of hints and tips and tricks as to how to find out and contact your landowner in the access section of our resources page. And we also do provide an access permissions letter, which has been written by us. It is signed from us, I believe it's from myself, that you can include your name, your contact details, and you can provide to any landowner with information about the scheme and what it is you're hoping to do and why, importantly. Any problems at all in terms of even contacting, getting an answer from landowners or with landowners' questions, please do not hesitate to get in touch. We are more than happy to help. We would not want you to feel put off by this stage at all. And we tend to say, make sure you say thank you at the end of the survey season. Do keep them, informed of what you're seeing. Make sure that you keep them informed of the dates that you're planning to visit, and just keep that good relationship. We find that in the vast majority of cases, landowners are super interested. They'd like to see, they want to hear more. They ask for copies of the data, which is, of course, absolutely fine. It was collected on their land. So as I say, please do just get in touch with those, make sure you have permission. And if you have any difficulty at all, please do get in touch and we can help you out. So the main points to consider when we do think about plots are that we suggest you aim for ideally 3 5x5 metre plots and 2 linear plots, so 1 by 25 metre plots. The pre-selected plot locations on your map are recommended if possible, and that's essentially to avoid site selection bias. So I'll come on to those pre-selected plots in a moment. Surveys should only be carried out within NPMS habitats, and ideally each plot should be located in a different habitat. But of course, we appreciate this can be very difficult to have 5 different habitat types within just 1 kilometre square. So we just ask you to do different as far as possible. Another tricky problem could be if, for example, you have a coastal square or a square where actually only a proportion of that square falls within NPMS habitat type. So we do aim for 5 plots, but I believe our national average is for volunteers to have 4 plots. So we aim for 5, but if you can't quite make 5 plots, it's fine if you need to have 3 or 4, depending on the square that you are allocated. So just to give a brief overview of how these 5 survey plots are selected within the monads or the kilometre squares. We provide these square maps to each allocated volunteer. So a bit like the example that we can see here. They'll all look something like this. And the pre-selected number plot locations that we can see here, so the small numbered squares, that I don't believe are to scale. They're essentially in place as recommended plots for you to first investigate and see if it's possible to create plots in order to add an element of randomization to your plot selection. Because if you can imagine, if we were all able to choose our exact plot locations, we may very well end up choosing the really rather nice patch of orchids in the corner of the grassland. And of course, as lovely as this is, if it's scaled up nationally, it could give a misrepresentation of what is really happening in our habitats. So if your plot is considered, oh my goodness, dare I say it, boring, we completely understand it can be a little bit frustrating, but actually something that we're saying all the time, absence data are just as important as presence data. And hopefully you should have a good variety between your 5 plots. It's really important that we, as I say, we have this absence data because this is how we're measuring the health of our habitats, and it's vitally important to know what isn't there as well as what is there. But in the guidance note, you will also see something called Protocol A, and that is regarding self-selecting plots. So while we ask you to take a look at these recommended plot locations first and see if it's at all possible or appropriate to survey at these sites, it's not always going to be. There may be problems with land access permissions. There may be safety implications. It may just simply be difficult to access, even if you do have permission. It may not be totally suitable. It may not be a plot which falls within an NPMS habitat type. In which case, of course, it is absolutely possible to create your own plots, to self-select your own appropriate, accessible, safe plots that you can comfortably survey. It's simply a case of we ask you to take a look at those recommended plots first, if at all possible. The other thing it is worth mentioning is these habitat maps that we provide. They are there as a guide, as a suggestion of what the habitat is most likely to be within the square. Of course, we don't have the capacity or the staffing to actually go out and visually check every single square. So these are generated using a combination of remote sensing, land use inventories taken, over the course of a number of years. So they are estimates. So the real the real way to know what habitat you're really seeing within your square when you visit your plot is you. It comes down to you going and taking a look. So if you get to a plot location and your map tells you that you're expecting to see broadleaf woodland, and you get there and you think, this is definitely not a broadleaf woodland anymore. It may well have used to be, but it's being felled now, for example. That's absolutely fine. As I say, these are composite maps. They are estimates. So if you go to a plot and you find out that it's not correct, that's absolutely fine. We want to make sure that you're recording what is actually there in the field. They're there, as I say, as a guide. A lot of the time they will be correct, but please don't be thrown off if there's been an update to that area. There's been a change in management, for example. That means the habitat type is now different. So once you have your plot locations, you've decided where your 5 plots are going to be within the square. I've just put on here a quick overview of plot setup. So whilst you're on site, we recommend that you use fixed landmarks to record the plot location, just to help you relocate it in future, find where you were during your last survey, and please to set up only temporary markers. We ask you not to leave anything behind. We then say to record GPS coordinates, particularly in the southwest corner. That's our standard method for all volunteers to record the GPS coordinates in the southwest corner. We ask you to make a plot sketch with a written description, and it's really useful to take an annual photograph from the same point, in the same angle. Now, we're not expecting everybody to have their own GPS recording devices. I even don't have one. You can generally get those using free apps, perhaps on your smartphone, using maps, maybe when you get back home, finding it on a Google map, for example, or on the NPMS website. as I say, we're not expecting volunteers to go out and buy themselves GPS devices. The reason we ask folk to take a plot sketch or to draw down your plot isn't, you know, to test your artistic prowess. We're not expecting anything beautiful, but we found that it's a really helpful way to perhaps pick up on things that you might have missed just by noting it down or taking a quick picture. It really gets you to think about what you're seeing, how you can re-find that location again and notice these sort of different features within that landscape. And of course, a written description. Linear plots can be along an arable field margin, a hedgerow or a watercourse. Woodland plots are larger. They are at 10 by 10 metres. And this plot setup is done on the website after your square recce, and it's once you've done it in that first year, it's then set up and ready to be simply surveyed twice a year. So once you've decided on your plot, you've recorded its location, all of that information to re-find it again. That's done. You've entered that on the website and you're simply ready to enter the data for each survey from then on out. We do offer a lot of support and guidance on this stage with YouTube videos guiding people through it. And we now have the start of a mini video series to help people in methodology and plot creation with our handy how-to guide playlist on YouTube. And the thing that I always say is this bit does take or can take a little bit of time to really get to know your squares, get to know your plots, make sure you've fully recorded how to find them, but it is so worthwhile spending that time now. It will make things a heck of a lot easier each time we revisit. It'll make it easier to re-find the plots. So you can really hit the ground running in spring. And actually, this is a really great time to be starting out with NPMS. Sometimes I think people feel like they've missed the boat slightly. We're right at the end of the survey season, but actually, this is a really great time to get your teeth stuck in, to really getting to know the square, finding out your land access sort of situation and land access permissions, really deciding where you're going to put your plots, what the habitats are, and just really getting to know the site so that you're ready to hit the ground running in spring. So here you can see an example of field kit. We've got our trusty Weatherwriter clipboard. We have marked bamboo canes. I've used long tent pegs. I'm sure somebody's previously mentioned using knitting needles. So anything that can mark the corners of your plot. We've simply torn up and used some scrap fabric here to make flags on them. It's particularly useful for me because I'm quite clumsy and I trip over them if I don't see them clearly. You can then use a ball of wool, string, garden string, thin rope, simply to mark out the perimeter of your plot. One handy tip is to try pre-measuring the string at 5 metre intervals at home before you head out into the field, and mark those at each interval with just another scrap of fabric or a knot perhaps tied around, and that really helps you with measuring it out in the field. If you're setting up a linear plot, it's also really handy to have a metre ruler or a cane that you know is 1 metre in length to help you maintain that correct width of your plot. So using your little kit, quite a simple kit that most of us have around the house, you'll want to place an initial marker in and then measure the first side of your square with a pre-measured string or a tape measure, or even pacing it out. And the clipboard then is not just used to help you take your notes, but it's actually used to create the 90-degree angle at each corner so that you don't end up with a parallelogram plot instead of a square plot. It's then in the southwest corner or the closest to the southwest corner that you take your photograph looking at your plot, you get your grid reference and you draw your sketch. So just to show you sort of what it looks like, hopefully the short turf in these photo examples are useful to see in more detail. But as I say, we do have some super useful YouTube videos on this specifically, showing my colleague Sarah setting up a plot in the field. So do take a look at that. Another top tip can be positioning your plot so that it's parallel to a fence or a path or a hedge line, something similar, so that the orientation will help you to reposition in the same place the following survey visit. Then using the cord or rope, as I say, you align the first side of the square to that feature, and using the clipboard or a book even create that right angle to lay out the next side and working your way around the plot. And all of these are, some people say, I've taken a photo, I don't need to do anything else, or some people will take a sketch or note down a description, but we cannot recommend enough a combination of all of these things to really help you relocate your plot next time. It's really easy to be caught out. I put my hand up, I've done it myself. I've gone out to a field I know very, very well, a lovely wet grassland, to set up my plot, and I thought, I know this by the back of my hand. And I got there and gone, oh, okay, it does look quite different now. A few months down the line, it does look quite different. The vegetation looks quite different. This is quite tricky. So we do say to use a combination of things to help you relocate the plot. As I say, most linear plots will be 1 by 25 meters. For mostly arable field margins, standing and running water, rock outcrops, road verges and hedgerows. So ideally you want these linear plots to cover part of the feature that intersects with one of those internal boundary grid lines on your 1 kilometre square map. That's a tip just essentially for ease of recording and relocating. It makes it a lot easier to find the start of your plot again. But of course, you need to be putting your plot where you can find that linear feature. The plot should start at the point where the feature intersects, if possible, and then from any direction from there. We say to use 2 markers to establish the 1 meter width of that plot, and then using a cord or a rope or a tape measure to mark out the 25 meters in length. If you've got a GPS, either a device specifically or just on your phone, you record the start and the finish grid reference. And just like with the square plots, you take photos from outside the plot showing the surroundings and making sure that you've got the entirety of that plot within the photo. If the linear feature is shorter than 25 meters, of course, that's absolutely fine. You just record the entirety of it and the length that, in fact, that plot is. Make sure that that's recorded when you create your plot on the website. There are separate sections in the guidance note on linear features for vertical plots, for example, on rock cliff faces. And again, there are further details about linear arable field margins. So do take a look at those, some specific guidance for different habitats. So for example, when we are setting up linear plots and arable field margins, the plot should be extending 1 meter into the cultivated area, not within sort of the permanent sown strip. So we're actually looking a meter into the crop. And similarly, actually, with our freshwater plots, we're looking 1 meter into the water from the normal water level. Okay, I'm going to take a quick stop because I can see I've got a question. If a shrub or a tree is substantially in the survey plot, but the stem and or roots are possibly not, can be hard to tell in a hedgerow, then is it included or not, please? Yes, it will. What you'd be including is the percent. So when we record a species, which we'll see in a moment, we are essentially interested in ground cover of that species. So if that tree or a shrub, as you say, is taking up a percentage of cover of that survey plot, then that is what you include in your record. So yes, we do include it. Another brilliant question, can we use what 3 words rather than a grid reference? 100%. Please do take a grid reference. That's something that we always need to have, a grid reference, because that is where the data is attributed to in the database. But in order to help you relocate it, or if there's any other further, future surveyor that's going to be going to your plot, 100% what 3 words is incredibly useful. But as I say, for actually creating the plot to be sort of assigned to your data on the database, we do need the grid reference. Right, fab. Good. So just to recap, and for me to sort of regather my thinking, you've done a square recce, you have landowner permissions, the areas that you need it, you've chosen which plots to use, and you've successfully located your chosen plot locations. Hopefully you've set them up and you've recorded your GPS grid references, as we were saying, for each, and you've produced a sketch map and a photo, and all of this can be done before a survey, maybe during another square recce, or it can be done as you're about to survey for the first time. either way, once back at your computer, you will need to set these plots on the website first before you can enter plant data. As I say, we need a location in order to locate where that data is attributed to. Equally, this has got to be done on the website before you can start recording, as I say, in the field with the app. So if you're somebody who doesn't want to be using recording forms, you'd rather be recording on our NPMS app, you still need to create those plots and let us know where your plots are actually on the website before you can proceed to input data using the app. Whichever is easiest, of course, is up to you, recording forms or app. But as you can see from the form here on the slide, there's a section for your sketch map and for the grid reference for each plot and those supporting information, environmental information. There is a really handy step-by-step presentation actually on how to create the plots on the website, as well as a YouTube video demonstrating sort of how to navigate through the website and create these. So do take a look at that. Or I'm actually going to run a live workshop, so not a webinar, but a sort of a Q&A section and a bit of a data surgery coming up, where I'm going to be helping folk to create their plots and also enter data. So if you're having any difficulty with that, do take a look at our events calendar and sign up for that. Also, just never hesitate to contact us at NPMS support. We are also always more than happy to help you enter your data. So moving on to our NPMS habitats. As I say, there's 28 fine NPMS habitats nested within sort of 11 broad categories. We do ask you to identify the fine habitat if at all possible. This will give us the most accurate results in our models, but if not possible, use the broad category. Again, we're always more than happy to help you with identifying your habitat as well as species. Sometimes this can be trickier than species ID. So if you're having any trouble at all, please do feel free to send us in photographs, descriptions, locations, you know, what are the main species you're seeing on the site, and we will help you with habitat classification. As I say, there's a range of positive and negative indicator species, and the species selected are based on that compromise between their reliability as positive or negative indicators, but also their ease of ID and how widespread they are. If you have very few indicator species within your plot, as I've said, the information is still really useful. You may well get to your plot and find that you've got plenty of other species. You can see there are other species there, but they're not necessarily the indicator species that we've asked you to record. That's absolutely fine. You may want to record other species, and that information is still useful. It can be used for distribution maps, for example, but it won't necessarily be used to assess change in habitat quality. And so they're recorded a little bit differently. We have another form that you can use should you wish to. You're not obliged to at all. It's called our extra species recording form, and that is if you would like to record any additional species you've noted on your plot that doesn't fall within the indicator list. So the habitat descriptions you can find in our survey guidance notes can be really helpful with helping you to classify your habitat. And they're based in part on the excellent guide to British habitats. So Britain's Habitats, a guide to the wildlife habitats of Britain and Ireland. You can also find past webinars actually and presentations on these habitats on our YouTube channel. So an introduction to each broad habitat type, and for the vast majority, the fine habitat type as well. They can be really helpful to introduce how you can classify those habitats, the main species compositions, the indicator species that you can find within. So do take a look for those and any other future ones coming up. Just a real whistle-stop tour, because I'm very aware of the time, of the different habitat types that we include within the NPMS. We have broadleaf woodland, so that comprises dry deciduous, wet woodland, and also hedgerows of native species. We have native pinewood and juniper scrub. We have arable field margins, you can see there. We also have a number of lowland grassland habitat, fine habitat types. We have dry acid grassland, dry calcareous, neutral damp grasslands, and neutral pastures and meadows. You can imagine they're some of our most recorded habitat types. We also have upland grassland, so montane acid grassland and montane calcareous grassland. We have heathland, comprising dry heathland and dry montane heathland. We have bog and wet heath, so whether that's blanket bog, raised bog, or wet heath. We have marsh and fen habitats, comprising acidic or base-rich fens, flushes, mires, and springs. We have freshwater habitats, so the linear plots monitoring either nutrient poor or nutrient rich lakes and ponds, and we also have rivers and streams. We have our rocky outcrops, our cliffs and screes, whether inland rocks and scree or montane rocks and scree. And lastly, we have a number of coastal fine habitat types that we monitor. So from salt marsh, sand dunes, vegetated shingle, also maquis and maritime cliff tops and slopes. And in fact, actually, we have a webinar coming up, I believe in November. We have an absolutely fantastic botanist, Josh Stiles, giving us a talk about vegetated shingle, coastal vegetated shingle, and the indicator species within, which I'm sure will be fascinating. Josh always gives a fantastic webinar. So do come along to that if you think that habitat might fall within your survey square, or just if you're interested to learn more about these species. So each volunteer, prior to recording the species in the field, needs to decide which level they want to survey at. All the forms and the app are used in exactly the same way, really, for any of the levels. And methodology is the same. The key difference is the number of species which we ask you to record. So we have our wildflower level, which is sort of essentially the beginner level, or perhaps for people that perhaps don't have quite as much time. It essentially includes, I believe it's 212 easily identifiable species, divided into lists applicable for the different habitats. So actually there's around 10 or 15 species per habitat type. So if you're recording in a woodland plot at the wildflower level, there'll be around 15 species that we ask you to record. Then we have indicator level, which is a sort of an intermediate stage. It is an expanded list of those 408 species I've mentioned, again divided into groups applicable for those habitats. And that really just includes some species which are a little bit more challenging to identify. So thinking about more grasses, sedges and ferns, for example. And there are around 30 species per habitat at the indicator level. And then lastly, we have the inventory level, which is designed for volunteers who are capable of recording all vascular plant species, which they can find in a habitat. So as I say, the wildflower is the relatively simpler level in that there is a reduced list of species to record per habitat. So I've mentioned an example, say you're in a dry deciduous woodland, which is a fine habitat type. You may need to you need to identify things like wild garlic, hazel, ivy, holly at the wildflower level. And then at the indicator level, there is an expanded list to record. I believe there's 30 species in dry deciduous woodland to record, with the addition of things like wood sedge, wood millet, wood speedwell, for example. And then the inventory level is recording all the species present within the plot. So we don't necessarily need to worry about our lists. That's for people recording absolutely every species present. And you can see these divided within our NPMS species list booklet, which divides our habitats. There's a page per habitat with the list of the species that we are asking folk to record. So we can see them there. We've got the common name, we have the Latin name. If the species has that little wildflower symbol next to it, there's a column that says WF and there's a little flower symbol. If that symbol is present, that's at the wildflower level. So you're only looking, if you're at the wildflower level, you're only looking to record those species with that symbol next to it. If you are recording at the indicator level, we're asking you to record the abundance of all the species on that list. Of course, if you are then recording at the inventory level, well, then we can just throw the list out the window because you're, of course, recording absolutely all species present. So that booklet really is for folk recording at the wildflower or indicator level. You can also see actually there is a column that says indicator, and it's got a plus or a minus next to it. That essentially shows whether they are a positive indicator of habitat health or a negative indicator. It's not a case of the pluses are the ones you're recording and the minuses aren't, which I think a few people automatically can think. It's very much showing us whether they're positive or negative indicators. If you are recording at the indicator level, you need to record abundance of all of those species on the list. And super handily, actually, that last column you can see on the right is the page number where you can find that species in our species ID guide. There are loads of training options. I've already mentioned our NPMS YouTube channel, which has species and habitat specific webinars and training and notes and handy guides, also for your survey methodology. But of course, there are a number of different books and web resources. We have a lot of our resources online on the online training resources page of our website. So essentially sort of readable versions of our webinars and our workshops. And we also run interactive workshops, both online and in the field throughout the year. So do keep a look on both our training events and our training webinar pages of our website. It's quite a busy community with lots of volunteers getting involved in lots of different events. So please do join in. And of course, ask us for help. We absolutely love to get photos, as you can imagine, of species and to help our volunteers identify them. Much rather look at a lovely image of a plant than a spreadsheet, for example. And of course, I work for Plant Life, so I have a lot of people around me, if I'm struggling to, that can help me help you. So do please get in touch. So I'm going to have a quick look. Have I got any more questions? There's no questions popping up at the moment, so I'm going to move straight on to actually looking at our recording forms. So you can see here, this is the front page of our recording form. And I'll show you in a moment the back page. One key thing to say is it is one recording form per plot. So you use the same recording form for your first and your second visit to the plot. So you can see the key thing to fill really clearly every visit at the top is, of course, your name and the grid reference, your square number, what level you are recording at, the date of your first survey, when you first make your first survey visit, and then later the date of your second survey. Even though you will have created this plot, previously, you've created it online, it's still really good practice to make sure that you're filling in those OS grid references each time, and you note down the plot number. We ask that you record the broad habitat and the fine habitat each visit as well, even though, again, these are unlikely to change, or they certainly don't change. They're unlikely to change between years, but it does happen. For example, if there's a management change or whatnot. So record the broad habitat type and the fine habitat type. And there's some other environmental conditions and variables to enter there as well. For example, if the plot is sloping and in which direction. We also ask you to record management type, which it says optional on there, but it can be incredibly useful if you do know. So, for example, it might be very obvious what the management type is. You may see the landowner conducting coppicing, brush cutting, mowing, grazing. That might be information that you are given by a landowner. So anything that you do know, do note. There are some examples of management types listed in the survey guidance notes. And then we can see that we've got an option here for grazing, and that's our first sort of example of where we can see we've got a box to enter the information for the first visit and then later the second visit. So grazing may well be low when you make your first visit, in which case, you can tick the low on the left-hand side, and it may be moderate on your second visit, in which case you tick the second box for moderate. Again, there's guidance in the survey guidance note as to how you discern whether it's low, moderate or high, but they're quite broad categories. Low, for example, would be the vegetation is really quite high. There's not much evidence of grazing. Moderate, you're more likely to see some evidence of grazing, perhaps some dung, some droppings. The vegetation are at varied heights. And then, of course, you've got high grazing intensity, where you can see that the vegetation is cut back really quite short. There's evidence of grazing, whether by cattle, sheep and so on. And then there's a note to add which animals are grazing the plot during each visit. whether it is, as I say, cattle, sheep, deer in some cases, maybe even rabbits, do note what animal is known to be grazing. It might be more than one. We then ask how wooded your plot is, again from the categories shown here on the recording form, and then we have our vegetation height categories. So again, we've got a box here for each visit, and that's essentially the proportion of your plot that falls within those categories. So what proportion of your plot falls within less than 10 centimetres, for example? Is it none at all, in which case you would put a 0? Is it between 1 and 33%, or a third, in which case you'd write 1? If it's between a third and 2/3, you would write 2, and if it's between 2/3 and 100%, you would write 3. And you do that for each of your visits. And then you can see there's a box at the bottom just to note down any additional comments. So anything that could be impacting what you're seeing on that day, such as weather conditions. Has there been recent management? Has it recently been very dry? Was there heavy rainfall the week previous? Anything at all that you notice on that plot. It's all really useful information. It's better to have it than not. So there is a free box there. And when you enter the data later, for any additional comments you have regarding your plot. So I can see somebody has put, should we always try to record at inventory level if we have time? Not necessarily. We would definitely say only to record at inventory level if you are 100% confident that you are able to identify every vascular plant species, which of course is a challenge. If you are, then amazing, that's great. If at all possible, if you can record at indicator level, that's really a brilliant standard, because those are the species records that are going to be included in our indicator analysis. Inventory level is absolutely fantastic if you're able to. But as I say, you do need to be very confident that you are able to identify all species found. Okay. And now, so I'm looking at the second page now of the recording form, and you can see that there is a box at the top for your plot sketch for your first visit. It's unlikely that you're going to be doing that in subsequent visits, but there's that nice space there to remind you to take the time in your first visit to sketch out your plot. You can scan that in and you can add it to your plot details when you're creating your plot. And then down below, we have our area to finally get down to it and record our plant species. The thing we've been waiting for, I suppose. And to do that, we can see we have a table here where we have a column for the species name, and then you have a column each for your visit 1 and your visit 2. And we record the abundance of species using the Domin scale. Now, I don't know if anybody is familiar with using the Domin scale. Please do. Not everybody is, and it can be a little bit daunting if you're not. Are you able to put a Y for yes or an N for no in the chat if you have previously heard of or used the Domin scale, just so I know who it is I'm talking to today? Oh, a good mix. Hang on, let's go. Oh, yes, yes. Oh, fantastic. Yes, yes, yes. No, no, yes, no. Real mix, that's always the case. Actually, there's more yeses there than we're used to seeing. So we're going to go through in a moment how we do that for folk that haven't previously used the Domin scale. But essentially what we're going to do is input the species that we are recording, and then the code or the category along that Domin table that's provided on the recording form for that species during your first visit, and then again on your second visit. And you may find that you record something on your first visit that then you subsequently don't see on your second visit. That's fine, you would leave it blank. Or you may add another species to that list that you didn't see in your first visit, but then you did see in your second visit. We also do record, you can see down the bottom there, you may be able to see it's pretty small there, but if you've got a recording form with you, the percentage cover of bare soil, bare rock and gravel, litter, and by that I'm talking about leaf litter, dead wood and such, not our crisp packets or our unfortunate plastic bottle throwaways. We're talking about leaf litter. and also the cover of moss and lichens. And again, we're not looking for species there for our moss and our lichens, simply the coverage of the assemblage of mosses and lichens within your plot. So to look at these a little bit more closely, thinking about our domin scale. So essentially using the relevant species list for the level that you're recording at and within the habitat of your plot, you search your plot and to see what species are present. We tend to recommend that you start in one corner and gradually move out to the rest of the square. And of course, try not to trample the plants too much. I mean, there's always a certain amount going to go on, but just try not to trample too much, particularly when you're still assessing which species are present. And then regarding noting the domin scale, which can sound a bit daunting if you're not used to it, it really isn't. It's simply a way of estimating the amount of ground each species takes up as a percentage of that total area of the plot. Of course, it's important not to forget that we are including the leaves in that, leaves and stems, not just the flowers. And also to remember to look beneath larger plants in case any are hiding underneath. Of course, they grow in layers. So if you consider a square plot is 5 by 5 meters, another real tip is to take along with you a 50 by 50 centimeter square, because that represents 1% of your plot, and that can really help you get your eye in and estimate the coverage of a particular species, or whether it's bare ground or whatnot within your square. And I've seen volunteers doing this in a number of ways. I used to have a sort of a see-through acetate sheet that was 50 by 50 centimeters, so I could place it and it would really help me get my eye in. I could put it over patches of vegetation. I recently met a lovely volunteer who has a fabric frame, because then it rolls up super small in her backpack. I believe she keeps it in her pencil case, and then she brings it out and it opens up a bit like a fabric photo frame. And that can be a really handy piece of kit that just, particularly for your first survey of the year, you're getting your eye in to help you feel a bit more confident in your estimation of ground cover. And then you can see the table here, which is also on the recording forms. You assign a score to each species dependent on the percentage cover that it takes up of that plot. So if you have less than 1% and only, say, 1 or 2 individuals, you'd give that species a score of 1. If you believe it's less than 1%, but actually there are several individuals, you'd give it a score of 2. And so on. If you think it's 1 to 4% of that plot taken up by that species, you'd give it a 3. 5 to 10%, you give it a 4, and so on. So if the species are, of course, scattered, which they're likely to be, you kind of have to try and imagine them clustered in a corner, or if you've got your, 50 by 50 centimeter square, that can be really helpful because you can move that about as well. As we say, we do include the leaves, and we do consider that there are, smaller species lurking beneath larger ones. They grow in layers, of course. So it is also really worth remembering we're not trying to get to 100% here, which is we're almost kind of programmed, aren't we, to try when we're talking about percentages to try and get to 100. That's not going to be the case for a number of reasons. One, because they grow in layers, as I say. One, because there's going to be things like bare ground or rock and such, but also because you're only recording indicator species in a lot of the cases, whether you're at wildflower or indicator species level. So you're not going to be recording all of those species within your plot. Some aren't going to be there, some are. So we're not trying to get to 100%. So I hope that's helping towards domin scale, but just in case it's not, I've tried to break down this a little bit slightly, or we've tried to do this, my colleague and I, because as you can imagine, it can really be subjective. But as long as you're consistent across all of your survey sites, then try not to worry if your version of 5%, for example, is more like someone else's 10%, because ultimately we're really interested in change over time. So you just need to make sure that you're consistent across all of your survey sites across time. But as you can see as well, that, each score is within a range of percentages. So that does allow for some variability as well. And this is just something that can be a bit daunting to start off with, but you grow in confidence. You can take a bit more time during your first surveys, but you get more confident and you get quicker at estimating this. And we've just used this image of a lovely meadow, as if this is your square plot and you're looking down at it. I'm going to admit off the bat that this actually isn't the perfect image for these purposes, because it's at a funny angle. It's not in fact looking down, so it's a little bit tricky, but we're going to go with it. If you imagine that all the rough hawkbit, so for example, the yellow ones, are all squished together in a corner, but of course, remembering to include those leaves, not just the flowers, and then you estimate what percentage of the square that would take up. Have a little look at that and have a think. And if you're happy to, if you feel comfortable to, there are no wrong answers. It's all fine. We're giving it a go. Do feel free to pop in the chat what percentage cover you might say that rough hawk bit. I've got a 20% going in the chat. Somebody's been bold and straight out and said it. I'd actually give it more than that myself, but that's not what this is about. It's, do you know, it's so hard at this funny angle. Yep, Diane's gone for 50, it's gone for 30. So as you can see, to be honest, if we were out in the field, we'd be getting closer estimates to each other, but this is not a great image for the example. But for the purpose of showing you how we allocate a score, I've got quite a few 30s and I've got up to 50. So yes, I agree. I'd say it was between 34 and 50. So again, even as I say, if you're thinking 35 and I'm thinking 50, they all fall within that one category. But the thing to really note is how we then assign that a domin level. So say I think it's around 40%, 50%, I would look at the table, I can see that's a domin score of 7, and that's what I would give it. Similarly, the fairy flax, we can see, I'm not going to go through all of them because I'm aware of the time again, but we can, I don't know, can you pick out little fairy flax there, the little white ones dotted about? Again, considering we're thinking about leaves, the whole plant, not just those flowers. I don't know if anybody would like to hazard an estimate of coverage of our fairy flax. Again, very hard at this angle. Yeah, somebody's gone for 5. I'd say something quite similar. Yep, so I think the majority of people here are going to end up falling within a score of 4 or 5. I think if we were out in the field, we'd probably say something along the lines of, yeah, somewhere between 10 and 15, I think. But actually, again, that's a really common thing. You can think, oh, do you know what? It's really on the border. Am I looking at score 4 or 5? If I think it's 10, but is it really 10? Could it be a bit less? That's when really you need to be thinking out in the field, okay, are we edging more towards 5 to 10%, or are we edging more towards 11 to 25? What do I think? Which category does it fall within? And as I say, it can be a little bit subjective, but the main thing is that you are consistent, because it is change over time that we are interested in. So on my to-do list now is to get a much better photograph looking directly down on a plot. That's my to-do list for before the start of next season. But that's worked well in this for this exercise of showing you how we attribute a percentage a score. Okay, so moving on. So thinking about the aspect of slope, if the plot occurs on a slope, we ask you to record the main direction that the slope is facing from the normal compass range. So for example, north or northeast. And then to try and record the main slope angle. So flat would be 0 to 5%, moderate is 6 to 30%, and steep is more than 30%. As I've said, management is sometimes really obvious, and other times not so much. But are they livestock? You know, is there livestock? Is there any evidence of ditch clearance, hedge cutting, coppicing, and so on? Or what information can the landowner tell you? If there's evidence of grazing, as I say, how intense is it? So high would be very short vegetation, no real stems of plants, lots of dung, and so on. Moderate would be evidence of grazing, but actually the vegetation height is quite variable. So there's a real mix of tall and shorter areas. And then low would be basically really reduced evidence. Most of the vegetation is tall. And as I've mentioned, we also then record the domin scale for bare soil, rock, leaf litter, just as we have done. We give a score just as we have done for species based on your estimate. And again, just to just to cover again the vegetation height. We're looking at what proportion of the vegetation falls within these height categories. So you assign it actually either a 0, which we can't see on the slide here, a 1 for less than 1/3 of the area, 2 for 1 to 2/3, or 3 for more than 2/3 of the area fall within a certain height category during your first and second visit. In a woodland, actually, it's really worth mentioning that this measure is for the ground and shrub layers only, not the canopy. But I best mention that too. So I think we've managed to cover all of the areas of that recording form quite speedily there. So I've just popped up here as well a quick reminder of our equipment list for the field. Again, it's not it's not too heavy a field kit, or it's not too tricky a field kit. This list here contains absolutely everything you might need: your survey pack, so your forms, guidance notes, your species lists, your map, your clipboard and pencils, tape measures and string, your corner markers, your ID guides, hand lens if you have one, can be really, really helpful in helping you to identify down to the species level. Compass is always a good idea, especially when you're finding out your southwest corner. But again, a lot of phone apps. I personally use the OS grid reference app, and I get my grid reference and use it as a compass. That can be incredibly useful. A GPS device if you have one. A camera if you have one again, or you can, we're more than happy with you taking photographs on your smartphones. Your phone, of course, for safety, and that is the bottom line here. It's really important to consider your own health. It's particularly important to us because we want you to stay safe above all else. So we tend to say, please not to record on large bodies of water alone, if possible. And obviously don't try to get in and see that plant that is just out of reach, but you're really tempted and you've got your wellies on. Please don't. Do make sure that somebody knows where you are, how long you're expected to take, and maybe where your car's parked, when you're expected to return. It can be really useful to have that arrangement with somebody to let them know when you arrive on site and when you plan to be leaving. Have a strategy in place for them to call you if they've not received sort of notification that you're home safe and sound. There's lots of other tips on there here. Consider taking a small first aid kit, to make sure you have your phone, plenty of food and drink, all the clothing that you're going to need for our very variable British weather, and be sure to do a full recce and visit your site and get to know it before you start your surveys. So lastly, I'm thinking about submitting that all-important data. We've got so much help on the website for data entry with step-by-step guides I've mentioned for entering your data. We've got YouTube video demonstrations. And as I say, there's also a specific workshop coming up for data entry. And please do, register with that if you're interested, if you've got any particular questions. If you're not able to make it, please do contact us on the NPMS support email address anytime at all. We've got lots of different ways we can help with that. We can get together on a Zoom video call so we can share screens and work through entering data or how to create plots. We can talk through it on the phone, or we can simply describe on email, whatever suits you best if you're having any difficulty. But the key thing is we don't want you heading out there and putting that effort in and doing your surveys and not submitting that really useful data. We do ask that data is entered ideally by the end of October for each survey season. That's so that it can be included in our overwinter analysis. But having said that, we never stop people entering historical data. It just goes in future sort of rounds of analysis, and it might just get missed out from the latest version, for example, or the latest round of overwinter analysis. So the sooner that it is in, the better. But as I say, we will never stop folk entering that data. And you do that, as I say, by entering data on the website using the appropriate recording form. So you select either wildflower, indicator, or inventory recording form. They all very much look the same, but that helps us to see what level that you recorded at. And also there's a limit to what species you can enter the data for, of course. And as I've mentioned, we do have an in-field NPMS app. We're currently on a slightly older version, so there is a version out there at the moment. Some people are finding that with their new devices, it's not quite compatible. But we are in the process of road testing an updated version, and we are very confident that's going to be out and in circulation well ahead of the next season. So if you're somebody that would prefer to enter the data in field and not have to get back and, type in your results, that is another option. Everybody has their preferences. The thing to mention about the app as well is it doesn't necessarily matter as long as you have updated it and you have your plots created. You can head out into the field, and if there's no internet, there's no mobile signal, so you're concerned that you're not going to be able to enter that data, it's absolutely fine. It works offline, and you simply submit the data when you are back within range of the internet. So that's super handy too. Oh, there we go. That's everything that I've just been saying. Registration and plot creation does still need to be carried out on the desktop or on your laptop at home via the website before you can use the app in field. But they both essentially replicate those survey forms for ease of data entry. And as I say, just to show you what happens with all of your data, we aim for the data to come in by the 31st of October. It all goes into the NPMS database where it is verified through a number of verification checks, both automated and with the help of expert verifiers, expert botanists and verifiers. It is shared with the NBN, so the National Biodiversity Network, because the data is made publicly available. It's then used, once it's verified, it is used in conjunction with other databases as well, such as the BSBI database, and it's used in national distribution atlases, county floras, government commissioned reports, non-government commissioned reports. I've mentioned previously indicator, species trends reports and indicators, and there are so many applications of NPMS data. I think to date, NPMS data have been used in about 300 research papers. So not all that we're totally aware of, but there are several applications, including Natural England, Living England map, all sorts, AI training, all sorts. But it really helps us to investigate annual trends in species and groups of species, the impacts of changing environment and land management. So yes, super important that the data gets entered. I've already mentioned there's a raft of support on the NPMS website, both on our resources page and also our online training resources and online events pages. So please do take a look at that, and do take a look at our NPMS YouTube channel. We're also on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the usual places where we absolutely love to see what people are getting up to out in the field. People quite often use them to ask their questions, snap a species, even out a season, and say, can anybody help? What am I looking at here? We absolutely love to see those. We do have an NPMS support Facebook group for NPMS mentors and volunteers, and that could be a really useful place to share experience and ask for advice, ask for species ID and all sorts. So do take a look at that if you are on Facebook, of course. I've mentioned there are NPMS mentors. You can find a list of our regional mentors on the resources page. We are aware that we do have some gaps at the moment in coverage, where mentors no longer feel able to carry on, or they've taken on other volunteering roles. So we are working at the moment to fill those coverage gaps, but please do take a look to see if there are any mentors in your area that you can contact too. Do take a look at our webinars, our workshops, our in-field training days. We'll be getting a 2025 programme out in spring next year to let you know what we've got going on throughout the season next year. And of course, we do have our upcoming winter mini-series that has a real variety, actually, from habitat and species specific training events and workshops to more focus sort of on field skills and additional skills that can really help you with your experience, like nature journaling. We've had botanical sketches workshops, we've had botanical keys workshops, so do take a look at those. We tend to run those over the winter months when we're not able to get out, just to keep us connected and to keep our eye in through the winter. So yes, that's me. I can see I've got a couple of questions in. We've got 9 minutes now before Zoom kicks me out. So if you do have any questions, please do pop them in the chat. So I'll have a look at those in a moment. But if you go away, you put the kettle on for a cup of tea and realise, oh, I wish I'd asked something else, anytime at all, please do email us at support@npms.org.uk, which is largely monitored by my colleague you can see there, Karen, but also myself, and we will get back to you as soon as we can with any answers to your questions. And similarly, we have an NPMS phone that you can get in touch with, and we can talk you through anything you may be having difficulty with. Right, let's have a look. I got a couple of questions here I will get through. Will the Android version of the app be updated? It doesn't work on, yes. So that's what I've just mentioned. So at the moment, the current app isn't compatible with newer version of both Android and Google. Actually, it's something to do with the Play Store configuration. So only people currently with slightly older devices are able to install and use the app. But as I say, we will have it up and running by next season. In fact, it's actually already built and we are in the testing phase. So I've had volunteers out conducting surveys using the test version, the beta version of our new app, and that's going really well. So it will definitely be out in time for the next season, and that will be compatible with the new version of Android. So that's fab. We're really looking forward to being able to use that. It's been quite frustrating for some folk that have updated their phones or upgraded their phones. That's great. My square only really contains 6 workable plots, so I did all 6. Is that okay? Yeah, that's absolutely fine. If yours has got 6 and you've done all 6, that's absolutely fine. As long as you feel able to do that and it's not too much of an ask, that's absolutely grand. Brilliant. Thank you, Diane. As I say, we aim for 5, but there's a real variety. Brilliant. I can't see any more questions coming up at the moment. As I say, if you do think of anything later, if you're anything like me, you certainly will. Do feel free to get in touch and we will get back to you. Brill. Thank you. That's been really helpful, and welcome to the scheme, and hoping to speak to you soon and looking forward to working with you. Thanks, everyone. Bye now.